Hello, welcome everybody to another installment of the Fashioning Sustainability Seminar Series here in the Program on the Environment at the University of Washington. My name is Sean McDonald, and I am one half of your hosting duo for these seminars. My other half is right there, including a dog. Eli, you want to say hi?
Yeah, I'm like the quarter. The other quarter is the dog.
The dog. All right.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you everybody for joining us today. Um, as with previous weeks in this series, we're focusing on issues of sustainability in fashion, apparel, and textiles. And this is a seminar series that's been going on for the last 5 weeks. So if you've missed any of our previous seminars in the series, you can check those out on our YouTube channel. Make sure you subscribe to the YouTube, and you'll be notified the next time we we go live again. We have a great seminar speaker today. We have Chelsey Evans. She's a senior manager for sustainability at Etsy. In a minute, I will get to describing or telling you a little bit about her, and then we'll turn things over to her so she can share her story with you. But as with most of our seminars, I'd like to go ahead and start with an acknowledgement of the land. The University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. While we meet today here on Zoom, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we all call home. We do this to reaffirm the importance of the lands and our commitment and responsibility to improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local indigenous peoples and their cultures. So, as I said, our speaker today is Chelsey Evans. Chelsey, thank you so much for joining us, group. If we could just give her a nice warm round of digital applause. For those of you who are joining us via YouTube, you can just clap silently to yourselves, I suppose. But thank you so much, Chelsey, for joining us. I am so incredibly grateful to Chelsey for multiple reasons. One, she's here with us today, but she has been my guide to all things sustainability and fashion, and she's helped me connect with many of our speakers for this entire series. So she is well connected, and we do deeply appreciate her spending time with us and sharing her knowledge. So this week, Chelsey is going to share her experience working with a variety of major fashion retailers. Chelsey recently began her role leading ecological impact for Etsy as part of the company's impact team. But previously, she led environmental sustainability efforts for Nordstrom as part of their corporate social responsibility team, the CSR team there, where she found ways for Nordstrom to serve customers while driving system change on social and environmental issues across its value chain as a retailer, a producer of goods, a service provider, an employer, and as a community member. She was responsible for environmental sustainability, strategy, and goal setting, including climate change, the environmental impact of products, and circularity. So prior to Etsy and Nordstrom, Chelsey worked on sustainability strategy and crisis communication for retailers including Gap and Target. She'll provide her perspective today on the role of retailers in leveraging change in the fashion industry, and speaking to this idea of the triple bottom line, among other things. I should point out she also holds a Master's of International Business from the Fletcher School at Tufts University and a Bachelor of Arts in Communication from Pittsburgh State University. And I'm not going to go into any more detail than that because I think it's really important for her to share her own story with you so you get a sense of how she got to where she is, and the amazing work that she does. So with that, Chelsey, I would very much like to turn it over to you to lead us through today. Thank
Okay,
you.
great. Yeah, please type in your questions as they come up if you have any. And I figured I would just introduce a little more of my background. I know there's a lot of interest in this line of work, and I hope that, from my, buddies, Landon and Jancy and other folks that have spoken to the class, you've seen that people have really different backgrounds to get into this as a career, no matter what your interests are. But, as Sean shared, I, did work for nonprofits for a while. Maybe actually that wasn't even in my bio. I did partnerships for nonprofits in the early part of my career. So really that understanding how to build partnerships and what it looks like when you're on the nonprofit side was a big, I didn't know how applicable that would be, but it has been. And then I, with a communications degree, I moved into a crisis communication role with Target. So really started touching on this work by managing issues, right? So managing reputation issues for a big company, for a retail company. I think when you're doing that kind of work, it often is a risk mitigation approach. And I think that is a space sometimes that CSR sustainability has started. I don't think that is where this kind of work and these kind of activities live today. It's always a factor, but I think we've moved beyond it, which is good. From there, I did do my master's degree. So really felt like I needed to know more about business. A communication background was a great starting point for me, but was not enough to really pivot into doing the programs for this work. It would have been fine if all I wanted to do was talk about it, explain it, advocate for it, which is a huge part of what I do. And so I think that's been very useful, being able to basically translate complex information into something that everyone can understand, depending on who you are, what your background might be. But doing a business degree really let me pivot into programs, strategy, understanding how this fits in across a company, including multiple types of retailers. So kind of as shared, I worked for Gap as an MBA intern. So it was a brief time, but I worked in San Francisco with Gap Inc. I did a project for Talbot's, if you're familiar with that company, often found in suburban malls. They're based in the Boston area, which is where I went to school. Excuse me. And then I came out here for my role with Nordstrom, where I was for a while. And now I still am here, and I'm just calling in from West Seattle. I'm working remotely for Etsy in this role, and really have been, deep in strategy, really looking for opportunities. I think I've had experience bringing marketing folks and comms folks on board, but also I would say I'm working really closely with like investor relations teams now. And even more technology folks who are, talking about really intense computing kinds of topics in my new role that are above my head, but really important as you look at different company structures. So I thought also that what might be helpful in framing this, I know we have a couple of poll questions ready for you in a few moments, but I wanted to kind of introduce, as we talk about retailers and think about retail in general, certainly fashion retail as well, something I had not thought about, I think, earlier in my career, and have come to really differentiate, and you have to understand how these different businesses operate, is different kinds of retail. So I had this experience with Target, which is it's a discount retailer. It's a general retailer. They sell groceries, they sell soap, they sell clothing, they have private labels, and they make things, they make their own clothes. They source things in from third parties. There are so many Target stores. It's also an enormous retailer. I think when I worked there were around 1,700 in the US. I'm sure there are far more now. But then you could look at a company like Nordstrom, which Nordstrom would define itself as a multi-line fashion retailer. Some people would call it a department store. Nordstrom usually doesn't call itself that. I should say I'm speaking on my own behalf as I approach all of my experiences today. I do not represent Nordstrom, and I'm not really speaking on behalf of Etsy either. Just sharing a little bit about my own experience. Usually a department store might be something like Sears that also has, appliances. They might have some of that kind of thing. Whereas, Nordstrom has a variety of products. They have private label production as well as third-party sourcing. So you're going to get Nike and Levi's and Estee Lauder and, MAC. But then you might also have a specialty retailer. That would be something like Gap. Like if you go to The Gap or go to Banana Republic, where they're making all of their own products. They're really not sourcing a lot of third-party products. There probably are some, depending on the current mix, but mostly they're making their own named brand. So they have a lot of production in terms of what they're doing. Just a much larger footprint, upstream of things that they're making. And then some new ones, and certainly, Etsy is a platform. Etsy is a marketplace and a platform that doesn't hold inventory or make products, but provides access to sellers, making products and buyers who want to buy them. But also, a company like Farfetch, if you want to be, back in the fashion space, if you're familiar with that European retailer, also an online platform. And I wanted to mention kind of online only direct to consumer specialty retail that doesn't operate stores. So that might be, I guess we're seeing some of them move into stores, but you're seeing, Allbirds started out as online only, or I don't know, the company 4 Days, if you want to talk about circular clothing companies, some of these where they're not operating physical spaces. And so the dynamics of what you have to manage in all of these different kinds of a retailer are really quite different, and what or not different, but different issues have greater importance and might be prioritized differently, I would say, for these different kinds of companies. So hopefully that is helpful framing. I think we're ready for our poll questions.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I will go ahead and launch the poll questions. For students in the Zoom, these poll questions are really going to test your knowledge. Would you say so, Chelsey? These are pretty tough questions. I don't know. We'll see. Do your best. So here they are. Which stakeholders are most important for a retailer? So that's your first question. And of course, for those of you joining us on YouTube, we will share the answers with you, but you don't get to take the poll. So which stakeholders are most important for a retailer is the first question. And second question is, what do you think is a retailer's most important approach to social and environmental sustainability? I'm quite intrigued. I'm really interested to know what the students have to say here.
How long do we give it?
Let's see. We're ticking up. Maybe we'll give them another 20 seconds or so. So Chelsey, maybe while we're waiting for them to finish this poll question, you talked about your experience with these various, really kind of a wide range of retailers. In your experience, speaking from like a company like Target versus a company like Nordstrom versus a company like the Gap, that seem to be, they're retailers, but they're operating in such a very different spaces. Do you think one is any more challenging than the others in terms of how they address sustainability issues, or is it just a different set of challenges?
I think that they are different. A factor that wouldn't apply to those three companies that I think can really change the approach is actually not being a publicly traded company. So being privately held and not having an investor audience that has expectations of you one way or the other. I think in a circumstance like that, you can see sometimes really great activities coming out just based on kind of the values and mission of the company, what its leadership is, what its ownership looks like, or you can see really low engagement on this subject matter if, maybe it's held by a private equity firm that doesn't value, the engagement, the innovation, the risk management, the PR, all of those factors that can come through sustainability activities. So it doesn't always mean that it's bad to be privately held at all. Many companies, some that are the top of most people's list, if you think of Patagonia, right? It's like, oh, well, yeah, it's, privately held. So they can do what they want, and their mission and their goals are very clear. But I think for some companies, when they are not publicly traded, they don't face the same pressures for reporting and transparency and goal setting that a public company does.
Yeah. Good. That's really interesting. Thank you. I think I'll go ahead and end the poll now at this point. Let's go ahead and see what those results are showing us. So I'll share the results here, and you can go ahead and talk about them as you wish.
Perfect. Yeah, this was just fun for me, interesting for me. It was probably kind of mean. It was a bit of a trick question. There isn't really a perfect right answer, but it is interesting to see what everyone chose, or where no one, thought certain topics or stakeholder groups were relevant. I think what I would say is no one of those stakeholder groups are the most important. And I think that is a challenge of being a retailer and working on this subject matter, because there is a balance that has to happen across all of these groups. Maybe even some more. Those are the main ones that I, considered as I prepared for this. But I think there are different moments in time and even different topics that come to the top of a priority list for these different stakeholder groups, and different opportunities and risks probably within each of them. I would say that employees and job candidates are a very important stakeholder group. It's probably not the primary reason that companies do this work. Not exactly, but I think we do know that there's a great deal of research out there, especially with younger folks, millennials, Gen Z, that want to work for a company that they feel really good about. I think a lot of us don't want to work for a company that we feel like they're doing something bad in the world. So I think it is a recruiting factor. I've heard from some recruiters at different places where I've worked of like, oh yes, they definitely have read the CSR page and they had questions about that, even if it maybe isn't the most directly applicable to whatever role is being interviewed for. And certainly there's a ton of guidance that is taken from NGOs and nonprofits, as well as sometimes pressure from activists. So those groups do have an impact as well. And then across question 2, most important approach, I think, again, these are some of the breadth of topics and initiatives and work that needs to be done and balanced. And, in some ways, you're not going to have a very robust program if you only do 1 or 2 of the things on that list. So it is a challenging work area, because I think you wind up spanning so many topics, and, fundamentally you do need a number of people to do it and make sure that these things, someone is tracking things and reporting it out. Someone is taking the time to think through an ambiguous project to innovate and drive it forward and put it into strategy. And someone else is an expert on textile sourcing and production and can factor all of those things in. So
actually that brings me to a really interesting question. I mean, we think about someone, CSR typically being the focus of a lead at an organization, but I know that many companies, especially smaller companies, they only have one person doing these jobs. I mean, are they just essentially hamstrung by the just having to do too many things and having to be responsible for so many tasks?
I do. Yeah, I think that, yes, that can happen. It's common, I think, for anyone working in this field to, I think at conferences, or as we network with one another, and it's a very collaborative field where folks do know each other. There is an acknowledgement of managing workload, and finding the right way to do that is something that we're pretty conscious of. And it's an area of work that tends to inspire passion, right? I personally am invested in this work. I know that I am. And I think most people who have the privilege of working on these topics, you can't help but care about it. I don't know how you would do as good of work if you didn't care. It's not as easy to skate by. You need to be pretty driven, I think, to push it, because it requires change management and always pushing for more, always pushing for better, asking the next questions to take the next steps, because there really isn't an end. There's not really an end to the work. It's just continuously, getting better over time. But I will say, I can see within Etsy, there are so many working groups of different employees who don't have impact or sustainability in their title, but who are well informed, well aware of the subject matter that applies to their portion of the business. And I think, other companies have this too, of really creating strong working groups that are pretty I wouldn't say self-sufficient entirely, but have a clear direction and directive. Clear moments in time that they gather, the work gets distributed out among the group rather than being only on the person, with sustainability in their job title. And I think over time, that means a lot of people really are comfortable and confident in the subject matter. And this is getting integrated into more teams and more decisions all the time, which is exciting.
Yeah, that's great. It's fantastic. I'm just curious about how it all plays out.
Yeah. So, I mean, certainly I put those questions because as I was thinking through, how to talk about retailers, managing sustainability, social responsibility topics, I just can't help but think about it from a stakeholder management perspective of, how do you find any given retailer is going to be looking across, the competitive set. I don't think that I'm not sure that a Nordstrom is exactly comparable to a Walmart. Both are retailers, but the scale is quite different. Some of the subject matter is quite different. Or if then you put in like a European retailer and, the investor base is very different. Regulations, not the same at all. And so you really have to be looking across at who's comparable to you and also what are your impacts? What are you hearing from the activists that care about your business? What are you hearing from your key industry partners? Who are your suppliers and what are their practices? And so I think there are a lot of different approaches to how this gets done and what we're seeing different companies come out with. I kind of was jotting a few things down about some interesting things that retailers have done over time, because I do think it's evolving. One that I was watching for a long time years ago was Marks and Spencer, which is a British retailer. And I just think they had one of the earliest clear sustainability strategies. They called it Plan A because there is no like Plan B. They're just like, we're prioritizing this, but I think it was a 10-year plan. So then it was a little awkward at the end of the 10 years of like, what do we do now? Because we need to have a different plan. But it was just clearly defined. And I don't think that other retailers were doing that as well. But now we're seeing different approaches from different folks. Like I mentioned, Walmart. Walmart has done an incredible job of supplier engagement through their Project Gigaton work as they work to reduce emissions across their vast supplier base. And they're so large that has a huge scale, it has a huge piece of scale, huge choose factor there. One that I watched for a while was, there were some European retailers doing this too. They tend to be a little bit ahead of us in the States. But REI has done an incredible job raising the bar on product sustainability. So really thinking, okay, what's the role of a retailer here? I know it was in the poll. Maybe it's offering more sustainable products to customers. If the main thing you do is sell, then maybe the thing you should be doing is focusing on making sure that what you sell is better. They did a great job. I know it very well because I worked from some of what they created to create the same thing at Nordstrom. Amazon has since come out with their climate pledge friendly work. That is expanding as companies try to figure out how to highlight the more sustainable products in their mix. And that's something that the retailer really has to do to support the brands who are the ones making the items. The retailer is not in control of what Levi's does and whether they're making waterless denim, but the retailer has a huge role to play in amplifying the good work that's being done and getting it in front of customers. So it's an interesting space. But then, I don't know, Farfetch, for example, has been really advancing work on resale, donation, and repair, which is a huge new, innovation and business model focus. Or then even IKEA is doing resale and also has really impressive sourcing commitments, and that's a different, if you're looking at an IKEA or a West Elm, that's a whole other kind of retail, right? And what they're selling. So what those kinds of companies' priorities are, again, might be different. So.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Well, I just want to, I don't know if it makes sense, Chelsey, at what point you'd like to take questions from the students, but I do want to just remind the students that if they have questions, they should either feel free to type their questions into the chat. We'd love to hear from them, or you can raise your little digital hand, as we love for you to do, and you could ask those questions directly of Chelsey, and she would, I'm sure, appreciate seeing your smiling faces. And I know that Eli has also been going through some questions that were previously submitted by the students, and can certainly hit on some of those too. So
Well, and I also just have a question of my
Great.
own.
you
if
have
I
your
can-
very own question. Well, of course, you're
if I
welcome to
could.
ask that.
One of the things that a lot of different speakers we've had today have talked about, not today, geez, this quarter, have talked about just the possibility or their own thoughts about having like a stronger sort of third party certification process. And I'm just curious, you haven't really talked about that. You've talked about a lot of individual retailers doing different things, but do you see a future that has some sort of a third party certified sustainable products stamp of approval sort of thing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's hard to imagine a singular stamp of approval that would apply, because I think different products have such different concerns. And sometimes there are products that are promoted, gosh, like bamboo fabric just kills me. It gets promoted a lot as this is made from sustainable bamboo, and it's like, yeah, bamboo, it is a really fast growing, agricultural product, and in that way it's great. But actually, like, there's a big concern with how bamboo is turned into fabric. So I think that sometimes, so if you were only looking at, is this a renewable natural resource? Okay, great. Then like stamp of approval. But how do you factor in the other elements of, it's processed into fabric in a really chemical and energy intensive process that actually doesn't make it great, even if, I don't know, it's always promoted as being like compostable at the end. I don't know who's composting their, bamboo sheets or whatever, their viscose sheets, which is usually what bamboo is made into, is viscose or rayon. But I just think a singular stamp of approval would be pretty difficult to achieve. And I will say, having joined Etsy and moving from a place where I'm in a company that is sourcing, a great number of products from one single brand made in one singular way, to a global marketplace where everything is unique, it's kind of like, well, I don't know how those things would ever take the singular stamp of approval. I mean, that is something else entirely. And I think you could look at that on an Amazon, and another marketplace kind of a thing too, that's sourcing things in a more commodity way. It's a little too vast for a singular stamp. But I do like the acknowledgement of multiple different kinds of certifications that do apply to a given type of a product. I think that is helpful. I think that it has been helpful that the information a certification might carry with it is becoming less precious, less, I think there was a time, it's still happening actually, but of trying to dumb down what it means and trying to over explain, like, it's GOTS certified or it's Okotex certified, Blue Sign is produced in a Blue Sign factory. I think there was a time when everyone felt like that had to be fully explained. But I love that if I just go in Target, it just, some of their home or their private label products are just saying Okotex certified. Like, there's no explanation. I'm not providing more. It's if you want to learn more, or if you are informed, you will understand what this means. And I do. And I'm like, great, I love that. Like, perfect. And an expectation, I think, that consumers are learning more and becoming more educated and comfortable with the topic. And I think that we all have become comfortable with those topics a little bit more anyway, when it relates to our food. So I don't think that it's impossible to think that some of those things become more, commonly known.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I know that Eli probably already has some other questions, but when you brought up one thing that struck me, you've moved from working at retailers that, in the case of Nordstrom, brick and mortar kind of place, to now Etsy, this sort of global online marketplace. And I'm wondering how, from your perspective, how you see your role sort of shifting in the sustainability space. Is this changing the sort of initiatives that you're pursuing? What does it look like to you?
Yeah, I think naturally, anytime you shift roles and you do this kind of work, some partnerships you were a part of, some initiatives you were working on are going to go away because that's not what your new company is doing. And then also new things get added to your plate. One thing that I guess I'm excited about that's new for me at Etsy is a very is a company that's willing to talk more publicly, speak more publicly, stand up for these topics. I think there's a lot that for a marketplace is not within Etsy's control. And, you know, if we want to reach net zero by 2030 in terms of our emissions, which we do, then that's going to require decarbonization efforts in the transportation sector. And we're not in control of what kind of fuel FedEx uses or USPS, you know, or any other carrier partners. That's not up to us, but we can ask for positive changes at, you know, at a national level or at a subnational level and say, hey, this is important to us. We have this goal. We need others to set these goals and make these achievements. And how can we find a way to innovate and pilot and try new things? The company speaks up a lot more. And that feels very significant to me. I think that I would say that to the student group. I would say to anybody, I think that we all need to be speaking up more and staying engaged on that. To just acknowledge that we're not going to save the planet by like buying, you know, an organic cotton t-shirt. Like we're not going to buy our way out of the problems that we're facing. So I do think that it has to do with speaking up. I mean, I think that shopping better when you can is better. You know, if you can buy something used, if you can take care of what you have for longer and keep it in use longer, if you can hang it to dry, as I know I have a rack of clothes upstairs, you know, hanging there, which I like to do because it helps the clothes stay in better condition longer, frankly, let alone any energy savings. But, you know, there's a lot of things involved here, but I think a fundamental discomfort in this retail space, as we talk about these environmental concerns, is, you know, we're still buying things, and buying things isn't going to, you know, get to the solution that we need. But I also don't know how to get people to buy nothing. I think that our economy runs to some extent on an idea of consumption. So how can we, you know, advocate for the really large change that we need and then like make small positive changes, better choices when we can.
Yeah, thank you. I see that Amy Lynn has her hand up. Amy, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, yeah, thanks so much, Sean. Hi, Chelsey. I have a question. What is the toughest part about your job, and what keeps you motivated to continue to work in the space?
Yeah, I think a tough thing about this kind of work is maintaining a sense of urgency and a sense of patience at the same time, of feeling like you want to show up and push every day, but also accepting that like you're going to hit walls, you know, over and over, and you have to find a way through them, find a way over them or around, or bide your time until 6 months later when, you know, you have some new consumer insights that proves your point, or a person changes jobs and the new person in the role actually will be a good partner, you know, and trying to navigate that. There's definitely a lot. I think that having high emotional intelligence and kind of being able to navigate politically through it is pretty important and tough. I think, okay, what keeps me motivated? Oh, I mean, in some ways, I guess I think that it would serve you well to be a curious person if you do this kind of work. And you know, you just wind up interested in a lot of topics. So getting to keep learning about new things and feeling like what you're doing is valuable, like obviously feeling like what you're doing is valuable is very motivating. But it is fun. Like for me, it is fun to get to dig into new things and learn about them and feel like you can become somewhat, not an expert, but somewhat, you know, you can become pretty well informed on all of these topics if you just are interested enough to do it. It's not, for the most part, it's not an obstacle. There's not a barrier that would stop anyone from knowing a lot about any of this.
Thank you. That's super inspiring.
Thank you, Amy, for your question. Eli, do we have some other questions that you want to highlight?
Well, I was pinging Catherine here in the chat because I think she asked a really good question, and it sort of building off of what we were just talking about prior to Amy's question, but it's sort of just, how do you, like, Etsy is entirely an online store, right? So how can an online store kind of help develop environmental consciousness at the level of sort of the individual producer? Because you're sort of thinking about Etsy as like sort of pushing the needle on like deliveries and things like that, but does it push back on the producers, within the system?
I think that's a good question. And I might not really know the answer yet. I'm still, 2.5 months in. So I can't say that I have interacted with any sellers yet, aside from, maybe people in my personal life who I know who, run an Etsy shop. I think much like so many companies, companies are structured differently. And what Etsy has done is acknowledge that it's always e-commerce, right? Everything's coming to you in the mail, somehow it's being shipped to you. And so Etsy's been a carbon neutral company since 2019, and they have been offsetting emissions related to shipping any products. So while that isn't acknowledging the production of the products yet, which are just such a vast variety of products it's even a hard question to answer at all. But anything that's coming to you, those emissions are being offset. And now the company is also offsetting any emissions related to the packaging that a product comes in, which again is something that Etsy is not in control of. So that's just acknowledging, getting data about what the sellers are using to package items in, whether it's a reused package, which happens, or a box, a padded mail, or a poly mail, or just an envelope. We're able to gather a lot of that information and then offset it. And what I think is great about that, as we've then set this goal to be net zero by 2030, is the company really has skin in the game. Naturally, that creates an incentive to want to create an absolute reduction, an actual reduction in emissions that are related to shipping, in emissions that are related to packaging. And I think that's exciting. I think getting the incentives to align is great. Whereas I've seen in other settings, a goal to reduce plastic, but at the same time, that e-commerce is growing and that a plastic poly mailer is a really convenient way to send. It's cost effective, it protects the product. In that regard, it's a great way to send something to a customer, but it's sending more plastic into the world, and they're very hard to recycle. That kind of if you're getting a plastic bubble mailer in the mail, a plastic poly mailer, you have to take it, you have to gather it and eventually take it to a grocery store or a Target or a Lowe's, someone that is taking those back, but none of us are really able to recycle those at home. And so, you just wind up working at cross purposes, whereas I feel like if you can get the incentives to align correctly, then the progress, I think, and the alignment across teams gets a little more clear, which is helpful.
Yeah, I can understand that. Oh, I see Catherine has her hand up. Catherine, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you, Eli, for asking my question for me. But so I was wondering, besides working with individual sellers to sort of incentivize, what you're talking about, what else, what does your day-to-day sort of look like besides that? Like what else are you doing?
Well, my day-to-day at Etsy is definitely still developing because I am still learning a lot. Doing this kind of work, it takes some time to really get a grasp of the context and all the players and kind of what everyone's priorities are. So I do feel like that's developing. My role is working a lot on materials and packaging. I mean, certainly I know a lot about materials of all kinds, especially from my time at Nordstrom. And so, I bring that with me to Etsy. Clearly, the company has a great deal of expertise related to carbon and emissions, and has been doing great work on that far precedes me, and is very impressive. So I'm coming in supporting, materials and packaging sustainability work, as well as some environmental advocacy work. So really getting to learn more about how we ask for, you might have seen, if you watched any of Biden's climate summit the other week, during Earth Week, I guess, there was this big initiative of hundreds of businesses, organizations, schools, cities, asking for a nationally determined contribution, which is, how much the country is contributing to contributing emissions that, cause global warming. And we're saying, hey, we want it to be a 50% decrease based on what we were producing in 2005. And we want to see that by 2030. So really standing together with other voices, but trying to say that very loudly, like, hey, we've made really big commitments. And now we want, nationally for the government to make these commitments and make it work for everyone. So I'd say that's part of my job now. That was not part of my role before. I think previously, and I could probably speak to this a little better just because I was at Nordstrom much longer, but the day-to-day it's a balance of being able to do a lot of different tasks and really switch between tasks a lot. Whether it would be, gathering data and planning for different kinds of reporting that could take anywhere from 2 weeks to 5 or 6 months, depending on the kind of report that you're working on. They vary in their levels of complexity in the kinds of approvals you need. So planning for that, bringing folks on board so that they're prepared to provide that kind of information. At different times, it's less on a day-to-day, but more on a sometimes every few years. And I went through this at Nordstrom. It was, we need to reset all of our goals and strategies. So there's a great deal of research that goes into that, stakeholder engagement, as previously mentioned, but then figuring out what are the goals that we want to set. And so doing that kind of work means working with key leadership, top leadership, the board, vetting all of these ideas and getting different teams to agree to specific goals that are going to specifically impact them and their work for the next 5 years, and making sure that they're bought in so that they will achieve them, because I had almost no power at all to achieve any of those things myself. I just have the power to propose them, convince everyone and get them landed. And then navigating how to do it is a huge group effort. Other things in the day-to-day, sometimes public speaking, actually. I mean, I'm doing this because I think it's fun, but certainly speaking on behalf of the company at times at conferences or on different kinds of panels, joining external groups like collaborative groups. Sometimes it's for learning, sometimes it's for different tools or requirements that external groups and coalitions have for the business. And so I need to join that webinar, I need to join this training so that I can bring that information back inside and make sure that we're meeting whatever is required of us by being parts of different coalitions. I also supported a lot of marketing and communications work. I was always very clear, like I'm not in a comms role, but at the same time, partnering very closely to say, hey, PR, this is going to have a really big impact. Like if you talk about this, it's going to be a big deal. Like I have my own finger on the pulse of what's happening in this space. I know what kind of things are hitting headlines, and I see it because it's like on my LinkedIn all day long. I see all of them. So you get a sense for what's going to matter and trying to help them understand that and get it out in front of customers or media, because I think there's also a sense of a cycle of you want the company to feel excited about, external response to an initiative, because that's going to help motivate them to do the work, do the teams to do the work. And then maybe if a leader goes and gets to speak about something like this and they get a lot of excited response, then they're going to be very engaged the next time. Trying to keep that motivation going, it's kind of a change management theory, really, is very interesting to me. And I think you see it play out all the time. I don't even know if I answered what I did on a day-to-day. That was all over the place, but
yeah, thank you for your answer.
Sure.
So actually, Chelsey, you sort of alluded to this a little bit when you said you're still sort of getting up to speed at Etsy, but before we even started the seminar, you were sharing just the sort of the onboarding process and how long that takes probably for a sustainability professional. I wonder if you could sort of speak to that in just a tiny bit more detail, because I think that's something that maybe for folks like our students who are interested in that career path, maybe getting a sense for how connected one has to be in order to do this kind of work.
Yeah, I've given some other advice on this kind of same topic to a student at some point earlier this year. And I was like, you really need to narrow what industry you might want to work in, or like narrow the kind of subject matter you want to cover, because what a Microsoft is doing on sustainability versus what maybe even an Etsy is doing versus what a Nordstrom is doing versus what Kroger is doing. Or like Tractor Supply Company is hiring someone right now. I mean, like going from Kroger to Tractor Supply, like I don't know if the subject matter would make sense. So I don't know if it has to be, if you have to be super connected. It's a really collaborative field. So I think if you are outgoing at all and participating in groups, then you'll meet people anyway. But I think I'm getting off track on the question. Wait, what was the?
Oh, I would just sort of the idea of in order to onboarding, sort of in order to create change and sustainability at these companies. The idea that you have to know how the company works from the inside out, right? You need to be able to know how things are happening.
Totally. What I was thinking about too, when you were asking that, and then I forgot, was that, at Nordstrom, I had the opportunity to build a lot from the ground up. So I found that over the course of 4 years, the company was on a big, I would say, development path on sustainability. And I hope that I've left it in an okay place, and that it, will have the great ability to expand and build on that moving forward. I know the role is still open right now, so that's why I'm hesitating. And I know that Sarah's on the phone and she's well aware of that, and that it's hard when a role hasn't been filled yet. But there, I learned it all because I did it all as the work grew. And I'd say Etsy is a company that is pretty mature in this space in some areas and has set really impressive goals, has a great track record of impressive work. And so what it means when you come in from the outside is, oh God, there's so much like research. There's all these decks, like we wind up creating all these PowerPoint presentations, these decks and like these overviews of subject matter. And I think when you're doing that for years and you start building it, that just gets in your brain and you know it. And you can, I can cite all kinds of Nordstrom statistics still just off the top of my head. But because I didn't personally do that research at Etsy, I'm still trying to absorb it. I'm like coming into a massive, set of documents, and like, how do you figure out which ones are the ones that matter and refer back to them and grab the right stats that really were quite persuasive at the time that they were developed or found or discovered, as we do our different research and try to learn what matters and what to do. So I think that is a learning curve of okay, where is everyone at? It's not at a starting point. I think if I had gone to a company that was just starting their journey and they were, they basically said, we don't know what to do. What should we do? For me, I could make some recommendations quickly, easily, and start building again because I know how to do that. But coming into something mature is different.
Yeah. Interesting.
Mm-hmm. But then you use some information. So, of course, like I did packaging work at Nordstrom. So packaging work, understanding what it means for packaging to be more sustainable is very clear to me. And that part is easy. That part is already in my head. I already know the players in the space. So I guess I would advise to the students, if you're interested in certain subject matter, or certain kinds of environmental impacts, even, okay, like what is impacting biodiversity? Okay, like go learn, like deforestation, like bad sourcing practices, pollution, like what are and like which industries are more guilty, or are there certain sort of geographical zones where, it's one thing in Indonesia and it's a different thing in the Amazon, and like what's causing it? Oh, it's cattle production in the Amazon because that's why they're clearing the trees there. But in Indonesia, they're cutting down trees for palm oil plantations. Like those are different reasons and different kinds of industries that are doing it. I don't know, learn like having some depth and context around certain subject matter, I think can help and be transferable. But that wouldn't be transferable if I went to Microsoft and wanted to work on emissions. Like it's irrelevant, like totally separate.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, Eli, if you have other questions, I want to make sure that we get to those. I do have one question though, just to bring it back to the idea of a fashion retailer.
Yeah.
This is something that's been on my mind. The idea of the retailer sort of sits in a very interesting space, obviously between the consumer, suppliers, and there are, of course, we hear stories occasionally of retailers that in order to meet their sustainability goals, oftentimes push the burden back on suppliers or distributors in terms of taking back packaging or making substantial changes. And I totally understand that putting pressure on suppliers to make sustainability a priority is how you might leverage things to happen. But how do you do that in a way that's equitable and fair and doesn't disproportionately burden maybe those smaller retailers or those that have less means?
It's a good question. I mean, I was thinking about it as a retailer putting pressure on a brand that they source from versus a retailer putting pressure on maybe the suppliers that they work with for their private label production.
Okay.
I think those things are very different because I think putting pressure on a brand to me feels pretty fair. That feels pretty fair. They probably already are sensing some of that pressure. Sometimes I would even work with a representative from, the North Face, and we would say, okay, what's happening inside your company and how are you navigating this and supporting this, as a sustainability person? I'm like, okay, I'm over here at Nordstrom. This is what I want to see us doing better because I know what our role is in this space. And it's, to be that customer interaction and like, how do we get you onto the website in the right way, in the right place with the right information? And so, I've been on calls where, I'm connecting with my sustainability peer and a salesperson from that brand, to make sure that they're providing the right information to the buying team so that it all flows through. Because I think there just are breakages. And sometimes the sustainability role can become a little bit siloed. Not always, ideally it's not, but it can be. So finding ways to navigate around that. I think the upstream production question is very important and it is more difficult because I think we have seen years ago and still we talk about the idea of audit fatigue where a given supplier, a factory where it's like a cut and sew factory, so they're cutting up this sweatshirt dress and sewing it into the clothing that it is. They were being audited by so many different brands and every brand had a different audit standard. And I think this still happens, but it has been an acknowledged problem. And there has been work done to try to reduce the number of audits and share them across the industry. But what has happened is a lot of brands and retailers have raised their expectations for different sustainable sourcing activities, what the fabric is, how the facility operates, whether it has to do with energy, waste, water, depending on kind of what sort of a facility it is. Getting certified, doing certifications can be very expensive for a facility or a factory. So I think that is still being figured out because I think that has grown, a lot of it has grown and expanded really quickly. And there's a sudden realization that, oh no, like the costs that are being put onto a factory are much too high, given, how they operate, where they operate. I mean, one way that I think we've seen, I don't think we've seen it probably enough, but just is different kind of financing models. Like how do you, and I'm not a finance person to be clear, but how can, if the factory wants to be certified or operating in a certain way, and the company, the brand wants them to be, then is there a way that the brand can help that facility access favorable financing to fund the updates or fund the changes? There's tons of research out there. I mean, I think we all know, and that's why every retailer that has brick and mortar stores has switched to, more efficient lighting, more efficient HVAC. Like there's ways to just operate more efficiency. It's the low hanging fruit of sustainability, but that kind of low hanging fruit, like that kind of capital expenditure is not always available for a factory to say, we're going to change all of our light bulbs. We're going to change the way our electric is done or our heating or cooling if they have that, or, whatever other infrastructure things in the building. But it will quickly pay itself back. So how can, whether it's NGOs, brands, coalitions of groups, how can they partner together to help factories in that way? Is a question.
Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting. Thank you. Eli, do you have one more student question that we can end the day with? I'm realizing we have almost been talking for an hour now at this point. I'm enthralled by this topic. I really enjoy hearing from Chelsey.
Well, there's a couple of questions here that kind of come together around the question of like Etsy being like basically an online retailer entirely, like, and thinking about sustainability from the perspective of an online retailer who doesn't have any sort of brick and mortar presence. If you can like think about like, I mean, and you've already talked about one, right, which is shipping. Like that's what are other sort of difficulties or advantages from a sustainability perspective? And do you think, if you were to, is there one way that is inherently more sustainable than another, like online versus,
I don't know if I have that answer. I mean, you can look at that and ask that question for any traditional retailer that has e-commerce, right? Of like, is it better to buy it online or is it better to go to the store? And there's different research out there that requires a lot of calculations, like how far is the customer driving to the store? Are they going to buy only one thing when they get there? Or are they going to buy 10 things? Are they going to visit 3 stores on their trip or just the one? And like, that's why even the company jet.com, which I think Walmart just sold or is shutting down, like it was an e-commerce company. And if you bought something, it would know which distribution center or fulfillment center the item was in. And it'd be like, oh, you're buying paper towels. Well, it's in this place. Here are a bunch of other products also in this place. So if you buy them, they will all come in the same package, which is like, oh, like I love that. That's what I want to know. Because if I'm adding extra stuff to a cart just to meet a shipping minimum, and then it comes in 5 boxes, that's very irritating to me. And I'm like, I wish I had known it was going to be like this. Like I wouldn't have done that. But if I know that I need 5 things and they can all come from the same place, come in the same box, yeah, that feels pretty good. That feels efficient to me. And manageable, but it is frustrating if you think it's going to be, you think, oh, this is great. Yeah, I think I'll try a few things. And suddenly you're getting a shirt that's a size medium and a shirt that's a size large. And you just wanted to try both sizes, but they're coming from different places. Like that's a mess. So that you could ask anyway of any kind of a retailer. I think in some ways, an online only retailer it is a little bit more simple. I mean, there are almost no physical sites, whereas a retailer with brick and mortar stores, it's balancing how to sell online and how to sell in person. And there's just a lot more operational activities happening, physical operational activities. So it means you have a lot more control over some certain aspects, but the footprint is probably larger, but I am not an expert on how much energy is used by data centers. So I am not a reputable source on that matter, but at this point, every company is selling online and we're all using, cloud services and data center usage and kind of the energy that comes from computing. Also not an expert at all on the topic of cryptocurrency, but it's been very interesting seeing articles come out about the environmental impacts of that. Like that's something else entirely. So it's those things that are invisible to us and we don't even necessarily realize. I think I read an article the other month about how much energy it takes to send an email and like what it means to get a direct email from, your boss with an attachment versus a spam email that was like sent from some weird email address and like mostly goes to your junk folder. And like they have different usages, different impacts, but I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't think I can answer, is one better than the other necessarily. I think it's better if you can receive packaging that you can recycle and it's not just creating waste right at the end. You get a pristine, huge box and you think, man, this looks perfect. Guess I'll just throw it in the recycling, or just things that become waste immediately after such a short time of being used. I think that's very frustrating.
Yeah. No, it's true. And I, one of the things that this brings to mind too is just sort of transparency, right? I mean, I always wonder about situations in which more unknowns are introduced. And I'm not sure if one approach is more transparent than the other. It just seems like sometimes when things are out of sight, and you don't necessarily have direct control over those things, that there are, there's the potential for problems.
Yeah, I mean, I think even in the little poll that we put up, I mean, one thing I wrote was just reporting and transparency. You know, I don't think that if all you're doing is reporting a bunch of stuff and being really transparent about it, that's like not really getting much actual progress made. But there is this idea, and I think there's truth to it, that, you know, if you're sharing things transparently, then, and if it doesn't look very good, then that's probably going to motivate you to change. It certainly opens you up to criticism, which scares a lot of people. But I guess from where I sit, I would just as soon have groups, you know, people, customers, whoever it is, employees, you know, putting pressure on and saying like, this is terrible. Because I think working in this space, you can look across and be like, if someone knew how awful this is, like people don't realize how bad this thing is, you know, just various things that you learn and come to know. And it's like, God, that's gross. And it's not something you can solve individually quickly by yourself. And they're not things that companies can solve immediately and quickly either. And sometimes they can't solve them by themselves. You know, an area that I think is growing is circular packaging, and like figuring that out. It's like, I don't know, it's pretty tough to do that as an individual company. You know, it's like a system that needs to exist. I saw someone on a panel yesterday talking about circular packaging, and she was saying, I want to see a recycle bin, a compost bin, a really small garbage can at everyone's house, and then a bin that's like reuse things that are getting taken back to some place. And whether it's a wine bottle that gets cleaned and reused as a wine bottle, or some kind of e-commerce packaging that gets reused as e-commerce packaging, I was like, oh, that's different. Like that's a new idea, you know, of a bin, of the way, you know, that would take multiple kinds of things that can all be reused and put back into the system. It's like, I like that idea. That's cool. I haven't heard that one before.
Yeah, the future.
Yeah,
well,
I think we're seeing some of that. Sorry, with even here in Seattle, there's what's the company that's taking back, you know, hard to recycle things like
Ridwell, I believe.
Thank you. Yeah, Ridwell. Yeah, but it's still not quite the same as what this other person proposed. So
yeah. Well, Chelsey, thank you so much for joining us today. I want to be respectful of your time, and I realize that we have at this point gone over. And so I just want to say once again, thank you so much for your time. I want to give you a big round of applause, virtual applause, and say that we really do appreciate you sharing your time with us again. For those of you joining us online, please join us again next week for another installment of our Fashioning Sustainability series. Tune into our YouTube channel, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and hit the notifications button, and you will be notified when we go online. Otherwise, have a great night, and we will catch up with you another time. Bye-bye, y'all.
Thank you all.
Thank you.